Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. As we mentioned, the text that we were dealing with, as far as the translation is concerned, there was some issues with it that led to some confusion. So let's move to look at what's going on with this uh, translation, which is online and is accompanied by the Arabic as well. And that's always beneficial because it allows you to check to see if there's anything that is left in need of clarification or correction as far as translation is concerned. So the optimal is to always keep the Arabic along with English. And we're going to make mistakes along the path, so it leaves room for correction. We were last on the issue of Sajda Sahu, and we dealt with the Sunan. We dealt with the Sunan, more specifically, the Sunan that are normative or confirmed or emphasized, the Sunan al-Muakkada, uh, or the Sunnat al-Muakkada, which is more correct Arabic. So we were in the section, we began the section today of forgetfulness. In the case of forgetting to perform Sujud al-Sahw, right? So Sujud al-Sahw is performed in the case of unmindfulness already, if there's a deficiency in the salah and so on and so forth. So in this section, what is the case is, what do you do if you forget to make sujood sahw? What do you do if you forget to make sujood sahw? So the Shaykh, may Allah benefit us in him by his knowledge, he states, Rahmatullahi alayhi, Shaykh Saleh Abdul Sami'a, I'm sorry, Shaykh Abdurrahman al-Akhdari, may Allah have mercy on them both. I was thinking of Shaykh al-Abbi. But Shaykh Abdurrahman al-Akhdari, he says, ومن ناسي السجود القبلية حتى سلم سجد إن كان قريبا. So here in this line, the Sheikh is saying that the person that forgets to make sujood al-sahw, in this case al-qabli, meaning sujood al-sahw in the case of a deficiency in the salah, in the sunan, sujood al-sahw made before the salam. If a person forgets to do that, a person prays and then salams out, then that person is to make sujood al-sahw if there is no dispensation, if there's no time lapse between his salaming out and when he remembers. So if you pray, you have a deficiency in your salah, and you were obligated to make sujood this sahu, then uh you remember, so you immediately make sujood sahu in that case. But if there's a time lapse, a big gap of time, or if you leave the masjid, if there's a big gap of time between when you remember in the salah, or if you leave the masjid space, then Sujud al-Sahw is invalidated, and consequently the salah is invalidated. Now we pose the question: when we deal with the ruling of Sujud al-Sahw, how is it that Sujud al-Sahw, here it says, وَسُجُودُ السَّهْوِ فِي الصَّلَاةِ sunnah. Here it says, Sujud al-Sahw fi الصَّلَاةِ sunnah. That the prostration of forgetfulness, or prostrating for forgetfulness is translated here, but the prostration of forgetfulness, it's a more literal translation, is classified as a sunnah, or it's a sunnah. It's not an obligation. At face value, it appears that there's a contradiction because here it says that it is a sunnah. Here is talking about the impact of leaving that sunnah off, the effects, and that is that the salah is invalidated. When we went over the acts that invalidate the salah, it was not mentioned that a sunnah act, its non-performance would lead to the invalidation of the salah. So how do we make sense of that? Perhaps one of the things that can be said is that in the madhab of Malik, like in the madhab of Imam Abi Hanifa, but more specifically in the madhab of Imam Malik, if a person engages in action which is voluntary or which is a sunnah, that person is obligated at that point to finish that action. In the initial stage, prior to the action, it is considered to be voluntary. Once the person performs it, then the action becomes an obligation. That is kind of an iffy stance, but it's one of the usuli conceptualizations, or is one of the usul principles that's kind of brought out to make sense of this. The deficiency is a deficiency also one of the things that can be said, which changes the form of the salah. It changes the form of the salah because of the amount of action which is deficient. That's another route that you can take to understand the logic behind this, right? That the form of the salah is established by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in this case, the salah is changed because the actions which are normatively practiced are left undone. And so here they give a number in kana ala thalathi sunan aw akthar. So three or more in this case is brought to the fore. Three or more is brought to the fore. And that is in the case of what? That's in the case that if a person forgets and if there is a gap of time and that gap of time is extended, or that person separates from the salah, such as that person was in a masjid or in a place of prayer, and then they walk away so that there's no immediacy there anymore, meaning that you can't just stop and drop, so to speak. You can't just correct it at the moment. You created a gap of time between yourself and the salah that shows you entered into a new activity, right? So whoever forgets the two prostrations that come before the salam, meaning because of there's a deficiency in the salah, until after he has already said assalamu alaikum, he should perform the sajda of forgetfulness if in kana qariban, if the time gap between his remembering and the salah is short. If the time extends out and a long time passes and then he remembers the sajda, or he separated from the salah. In other words, he left the place of prayer, in this case, the masjid, is salah. First, the sujud is invalidated and the salah is invalidated because the salah necessitated to be corrected. It had to be corrected, but it was not corrected. It was mandatory to be corrected. And we kind of try to work with that logic of how is it that the missing out of the sunnah can lead to the invalidation of salah, changing the form, the concept of going into an action and finishing it, right? Those ideas are there. Those usuli concepts are there. And here is mentioned if it's three sunan or more, right? Three sunan or more. Otherwise, if it's less than that, then the salah is not invalidated. So that's the first scenario dealing with forgetting the sujood of forgetfulness. The second scenario is making the sujood after the salam. If you forget that, then the default position is that you make that sujood when you remember it, even if it's after a year. Some put even more than that, but in this case, من ناسي سجود البادع, whoever forgets the prostration of forgetfulness that comes after the salam, sajadah or sajadahu, right? You can say sajadah because you pause here. If you continue the reading, then you recite the dhamma that comes at the end of the word sajadahu, right? ولو بعد عام, ولو بعد عام. So even if it's after year, then that sajda is to be made. And we went over this rule today, and we'll go over it again for the lack of recording. ومن نقص فريضة فلا يجزيه السجود عنها ومن نقص الفضائل فلا سجود عليه. And that rule makes it clear that the sujood is not enough to cover a deficiency in the fard. We mentioned that over and over again. And we mentioned over and over again that a person that is deficient in performing one of the fada'il acts of the salah, there's no sujood in that case. This is one of the benefits of classifying the actions of the salah into various categories to be able to determine what course of action to take when there's a mistake that's made in salah. So in the madhab of Malik, you have the sunan in the most general sense of the term, are classified into al-muakkidat, al-khifaf, al-fadail, those three categories. The normative, or as you say, hanif, the heavy, or the muakkidat, those that are of a lighter category, and the fadail, right? And the fadail. So the fadail, also can come onto the lighter sunan, right? But there's no, there's no direct uh sajda sahu made in that case. So the classification of the sunan in the salah excludes the fadail, because the sunan in the salah are related to sajda sahu, right? That's important to understand. And then here he clarifies ولا يكون السجود القبلي إلا لترك سنتين فأكثر, right? إلا سنتين فأكثر. ولا يكون سجود القبلي, the prostration of forgetfulness that comes before the salam, إلا لترك سنتين فأكثر. So here is saying that the sujud that comes before the salam is not performed except in the case of what? Uh, the missing or the non-performance of two sunan or more. Now, there's an important point to make here. Going back to this issue, so we clarify our reading. There was some confusion earlier. In the case of forgetting the salah, the salah will not become invalid except if there is the non-performance of sajda sahu when there's three sunan that are missing. This isn't a case of forgetting. You forget the sajda and you have to make the sajda before the salam. There's something that causes you to make the sajda before the salam, and in this case, there's a deficiency in three. So if you forgot three or more, and you forgot to make the sujud for it, then the salah becomes invalid. And we covered that. Here now it's saying that there's no sujud before the salam except if you miss out on two sunan or more. And that's the clarificatory point. There's no contradiction here. There's another scenario that locks in or comes into play here. This is in the case of forgetting, and this is in the case of forgetting the sajda sahu, and this is in the case of forgetting two sunan of the salah, and you remember, right? So, and you note that there is deficiencies in your salah, and you count them up when it comes to the sunan, and you realize that it's less than two, no issue there. If it's two or more, and you're conscious of that, then you make the sajda of forgetfulness or the prostration of forgetfulness, right? And then the rule of three or more applies missing three or more, and that leading to the invalidation of the salah. It applies to the case when you forget the sajda salah. That's a very subtle difference. Very subtle difference. So, and I wasn't clear on that before. And in the case of missing one sunnah, وأما السنة الواحدة فلا سجود لها إلا السر والجهر فمن أصر في الجهر سجد قبل السلام ومن جهر في السر سجد بعد السلام. Now this is a new issue. And for us, the switch, we understand the rationale behind it. What is the switch? The switch is in logic. He says that if one sunnah is unperformed or there's a deficiency in the performance of one sunnah, there's no sujood. But then he makes an exception. He says, except in the case of vocalizing or keeping silent. And what he's referring to is silent recitation and vocalizing parts of the Salah, including the Quran, right? So, because it also changes the form of the Salah. But these actions, the act of being silent and the act of reciting out loud, come under the classification of the muakkidat. They come under the classification of the muakkidat. They come under the classification of those sunan acts which are normative, which are heavy. And that's a detailed point. But if you already know the actions that are muakkidat, then this somewhat becomes redundant, right? And unfortunately, and I mentioned it again, I don't want to go into too much detail. You have to be aware of these issues when you study the madhab. That sometimes that's why the concept of the mashhur comes up. The concept of the mashhur comes up, at least in the area of the salah or the arkan. The idea of mashhur helps to solidify and codify the madhab better because you have multiple opinions. You have multiple ijtihadat. You have individuals working within the madhab, but they have their own opinions. And so the mashhur standardizes to some extent. And that's not in every case because you can deviate from the mashhur. And this especially when we start talking about social issues. When we start talking about social issues in Sanatul Fatwa, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayy, he talks about how a weak opinion can become a strong opinion in the madhab based on the maqasid of the Sharia and other principles of usul, like necessity and these types of things like that. In any event, here in what has been mentioned is that there's no sujud al-sahw for the missing of one sunnah. And then he says, except in the case of being silent or vocalization, right? And what that means is that you may make you may become silent in a time period where you should vocalize, or the opposite. You don't follow the rules of silence and vocalization that are part of the salat. We know them to be from the Sunan that are emphasized, that are normative, that are classified as muakkada. The problem here is that there is no classification here of that. And we mentioned that in the last encounter that we had, that the Izziya clarifies the muakkadat in a way that leaves no doubt. Herein, there's no distinction between the sunan except to separate out the fadila, except to separate out the fadila act, right? And so that can create a point of confusion. So we mentioned that. We mentioned that because sometimes in the pathway of knowledge, not every detail is presented to you. So as a teacher and as a student of knowledge, you have to be ready to accept that shift that takes place in your understanding. So the detail of the sunan of the salah being further classified into two types is extremely important, right? And we reiterate the madhab of Malik details out the Sunan acts into multiple categories, right? And the Fadila acts are Sunan acts, but they're on their own completely. They're on their own completely. The tricky part is when you get into this idea of a Sunan al-Khifaf or the Sunan that are lighter versus al-Muakkadat, and they're in the same category of just being labeled as Sunan of the Salah. That's tricky, right? But where we see the benefit of that distinction is in this issue of how do we correct the Salah. And we went over that discussion of classifying actions and terminology and so on and so forth as being part of the evolution of fiqh and it being a matter of ijtihad and having its pluses and minuses. And we mentioned that Shah Wali Allah, rahmatullahi alayhi, is one of those that indicate that these terminologies or these terminologies and classifications didn't exist in the same way among the Sahaba. And we also talked about how the Sahaba initiated the framework for it. But still, they're actions of ijtihad, right? The actions of ijtihad. Ijtihad means independent research, and in this case, an exhaustion of the scholar to attempt to reach what is beneficial and true to the utmost ability, exhausting all resources, right? Possible and available. And so when you have a group that does that together, or they correct each other because the scholar builds on the work of another scholar. It's not unlike cancel culture. You don't cancel out those that came before you because you don't agree with them or XYZ, but you build on their efforts and you eliminate or the weaknesses or the deficiencies in the position. And that's a logic that is missing in this time period. Let's stop here in this section. Let's stop when we get to this point about the adding, because then we come up to a new mas'ala or a new issue, which is the issue of shak or doubt in the salah. But let's complete this section. That way, we only have one section left, and then we will be pretty much finished with Sujud al-Sahw and al-Akhdari, and we can continue with the ladder of guidance, which adds other elements that are way more detailed from the Mudawwana and other places. But at least we get the framework of al-Akhdari with us when we study the ladder. because the framework is semi-missing. Um, the author says, "من تكلم ساهيا سجد بعد السلام." So now we move from action to speech. And remember, in the ladder of guidance, he related from senior scholars that the salah is broken up into speech and actions and other than that. So far, when it comes to Sujud al-Sahw, we've been covering action except in the case when we started talking about uh, silence and vocalization in the salah. But this becomes more clear now. If you add speech, من تكلم ساهيا سجد بعد السلام, a person that says something while in the state of salah, absent-mindedly is a good translation for that. Should perform سجد سهو after the salam. ومن سلم من ركعتين ساهيا سجد بعد السلام. And whoever says salam after 2 rak'at and they do so absent-mindedly, right, then they make the prostration after the salam. So if you're praying dhuhr and you salam out, you come and you bring the 2 rak'at that you're missing and you make your tashahhud and your salam, and then you make prostration after that to correct the issue because you added on to the salah. ومن زاد في الصلاة ركعة أو ركعتين سجد بعد السلام. So if you increase in the salah, in the first case you were deficient in the salah, sorry. In this case you're adding on to the salah. Then if you add on to the salah a rak'ah or 2 rak'ah, so you correct it by the sajda after the salam, right? As for he who added to the prayer a rak'ah or 2 rak'at, he should perform the sujood al-sahw or the prostration of forgetfulness after the salam. وَمَنْ زَادَ فِي الصَّلَاةِ مِثْلُهَا بَطَلَتْ. So here, this is a new issue, right? That if a person increases actions in the prayer, if you add to the prayer by doing the same amount of rak'at in one prayer, same rak'at twice in one prayer, uh, then the prayer becomes invalid. The prayer becomes invalid. So it's like instead of praying two sunnah of Fajr, you pray four. Instead of praying four, you pray a sunnah, you instead of saying four of Dhuhr, Asr, or Isha, you add on to that equivalent. Sometimes that could happen, even though we think it can't, when a person not in a good state of mind. They don't know what they prayed. You know what I'm saying? And that we can reach those states. Sin opens up to that reality. Also, being in situations that are stressful can open up to that reality that you don't even know what you're doing anymore, right? And those are some conditions and states that are trial and tribulation for the individual. You're not even clear what's going on anymore. You know what I'm saying? And that can happen. Uh, in any event, we ask Allah to protect us from that. So a new issue emerges. We'll go over this issue again. A new issue emerges, and that's the issue of doubt. And this issue is similar to that, which is shows the genius in the book that if a person adds to the salah that which is equivalent to it, and we mentioned some of the reasons why that may be. So he talks about here the one who doubts constantly, the one who doubts constantly. And in reality, this issue of waswasa is very much aligned to the topic of sehu or absent-mindedness overall, because a person can be subjected to waswasa, and that could be the cause of forgetfulness, and he's not aware of that, right? He's not aware of that, and it can be begin with light doubt about an action in this salah or forgetfulness in general without falling into doubt. You just forgot. The doubt comes in, you're not sure what it is. Now you reached into another state. Now, interestingly enough, in the books of logic, the idea of doubt is discussed in certainty, at least in the beginning sections of them. I have my own opinions about the role of logic, but there's a necessity to study logic in order to understand Islamic sciences. Whether it's a necessity of Aqidah or not is a different issue. But in order to study Aqidah texts, in order to study Usul al-Fiqh, Mustal al-Hadith, points in the Arabic language, depending on what book you study, is a necessity because it becomes difficult to understand those texts without some basic logic. But in the introduction to Aqidat al-Nasafiyya, and many, you find it more so in the books of the Maturidiyya, there's an introduction that deals with what we call epistemology or the theory of knowledge. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah wrote about that in Muqaddimat al-Tafsir. In Muqaddimat al-Tafsir, Imam al-Jawaini wrote about it in brief in al-Waraqat. These are basic, more lower level, lower tier books, but they exist. And so in those books, there's some discussion on this issue, and it talks about the state of mind in that regard. What does doubt mean? Doubt is being in between two states without being able to know what side to lean on. Is it, do I go right? Do I go left? What gives me some indication that it's better to go right versus going left, or what may give me indication to go left versus right? I'm not clear. So that in part is called doubt in the sense of logic, right? In the sense of logic. Now, the state of doubt can be a little different than that, but that's a way of the scholars of trying to map out the mind, so to speak, right? And so doubt could be a little different than that. It doesn't always have to fall into that definition or classification that you find in the system of logic. Just like Imam Ibn Rajab writes in his explanation of the 40 hadith with regard to the hadith of intention, he separates between the intention as it was understood by the Sahaba and the Salihin radiallahu anhum ajmain, and what is defined as intention by the Fuqaha. The Fuqaha or the scholars of fiqh give one specific definition for intention, whereas the Sahaba and the people of Ibadah, they say we're doing it for the sake of Allah. And therein, the intention starts coming in into issues of Aqidah because of the issues of the heart and sincerity, these types of things. So we always have to be conscious of how in the tradition you can have the imposition of one understanding. And we mentioned this before in the other session that we had earlier today. You can have the imposition of one understanding and it can wipe out an earlier understanding. So in that, the Salafi Dawah has a point. A problem that comes in with the discourse in the Salafi Dawah is that it also wants to wipe out the achievement of the scholars. Not in every case, but that's sometimes what happens in the idea of minhaj that is presented. So in any event, in this case, the idea of waswasa comes up. That's what took us into that discussion, how doubt is defined in logic and the role of logic and how it is that we also want to be open to other definitions, right? And then he gives a lot of scenarios in terms of he gives examples. He gives examples of that which invalidates the, I'm sorry, he gives examples of that which constitutes acts which require Sujud al-Sahw. Right. This translation, I believe, is Aisha Bewley's translation, which is a little more clear um, in terms of its presentation. The translation from Nigeria has mistakes, and the mistakes are too problematic to continue with it. But sometimes I like to introduce that type of thing, although it's not necessarily good for the student. But that's why we call this a study circle, right? Instead of like a straight class, because the class setup has it has certain rules that dictate the behavior. Whereas in a study circle, this not to say it's a free for all, it's not a free for all, but in the study circle, you have the ability to um, go into other avenues of thought. You're not restricted to just one thing. And so part of that is looking at translations, part of that is learning how to read, part of that is talking about other sciences and so on and so forth. And really, in reality, that's what you find among the scholars in the halaqat. Some people don't like it because they say they judge it and they say that it's not always systematic because the scholar goes off on tangents. And going off on tangents is not always good in the beginning stage of knowledge. There's no doubt about that. In the beginning stage of knowledge, being extremely clear and to the point is important, right? But sometimes, for the sake of alleviating the mind or the sake of edifying the student, you go off on tangents. But the halaqah concept or the circle concept, it allows for some freedom. Modernity puts on you this regimented, systematic way of looking at things, which it has its benefit. It has its benefit in that it has its place as well, right? It has its place. But what we discovered here, which is extremely important, is that that translation from Nigeria has clear mistakes, which are problematic. And so it is not advised to study from that, and the flow of the language is messed up, and so on and so forth. So that leaves us back with Aisha Bewley's translation.
Excuse me, can you hear me, Chef?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I had two. Well, the first question, that PDF, the PDF you showing, do you have that? Can you send that? Can you post that in the group?
I can.
Okay. My second thing, I noticed. I was thinking when you had brought up Ezekiel earlier. I remember he had mentioned some of the opinions from the scholars within the school, like about the like how
Oh,
intention means so much when you're speaking about these things. Like if somebody intentionally leaves off like the jahra in the recitation, the ruling differs from forgetfulness as opposed to deliberate. Because he said, well, at least in Isaiah, he said because they say that when you deliberately do it, this is negligence from the sunnah and the obligation. So it's different than just as opposed to because he gave the example before that where Ibn Qasim says, well, if somebody recited and then forgot the second surah and then in the rak'ah in the ruku, but he hadn't raised his head up, some scholars say nothing. If it was deliberate, it changes. So I was just thinking as you was talking, like the niyat is so important. The marriage it seems in the school is always focused on because that determines the ruling is different. You know what I mean? As opposed to like you said, I'm distracted, I'm going through something, or I'm just being negligent. So I just was thinking about that when you was
Well,
talking.
that's a great example from the angle of scenario-based thinking. And that's what we were talking about a couple of sessions ago when we were talking about fiqh al-madhhabi. And one of the strong points of fiqh al-madhhabi or fiqh according to a madhhab is the idea of, or fiqh in general as well, right? Fiqh is supposed to do that, but a lot of this came out of madhhabi fiqh, right? Is the scenarios. And the reason why that's important is because the mufti is the one that says the real mufti is the one that says, hold on a second, there's similarity between these two situations, but there's difference. And those details matter in order to come to some sort of determination on an issue, right? And so those types of nuances, the Azia is typical Azhari orientation in terms of consolidation of opinions, classifications, nuances, and all that. That's typical Azhari thinking, right? In terms of fiqh and so on. So, because Azhar has a long history of fiqh, it has a long history of dealing with this, and it goes into madhabi fiqh. And I mentioned before that in Azhar they also teach comparative fiqh. They teach fiqh specialized. They teach fiqh in terms of dealing with the legal system that dominates in Egypt. So fiqh is much more wider with them in that regard than what's presented in the concept of traditionalism in the US. Traditionalism in the US is devoid of deep connection with those types of institutions, although they claim they only take one part of the knowledge. They don't take all of it, which that's fine, but it has its deficiencies. But in any event, scenario-based thinking, when you're able to distinguish between this set of circumstances and this set of circumstances, that is is the idea of sabr al-taqsim and usul al-fiqh, which has everything to do with organizing, classifying, separating, all of that type of thinking. Because at the end of the day, the mind is going to come to the issue of what is the ruling here, right? And so learning that exists is different than learning that logic is there is different than just saying, well, the scholar said this. That's one level. That's a level. But learning that, okay, what is the benefit of that? The benefit of that is that point that you separate between circumstances and issues, and that will determine the ruling. That's why the fatwa banks that we have online can be extremely dangerous. They're beneficial for the person that knows how to use them. But one fatwa doesn't speak to all conditions. Fatwa initially was never meant to speak to one person and then you universalize it. Our fiqh is way much more detailed than that in terms of methodology. Fatwa was usually for people that deviated from the norm. And part of the problem of fiqh in general is that a lot of this fiqh was developed in traditional societies, agricultural societies. That's what we mean by traditional and so on and so forth. So there was not much change that took place in those societies. So a lot of the fiqh is speaking to a stagnant society, not necessarily in a negative way, but is very stable. Whereas the time of the Sahaba is all flux, change. They make hijrah, they go here, they go there. There's 1,000 things going on in this society. Is not a very stable society. And that's why you find sometimes when war takes place, the fiqh starts to change because there's instability in the society. You can kind of see that in Ghazali's writings, even in his thinking, it changes because there's instability in the society. That's why sometimes the scholars in Aqidah, whether Athari or otherwise, or Ilm al-Kalam, a lot of times you'll see that they're favoring stability in the society. So sometimes it looks like a compromise with the corrupt leader, but a lot of that has to do with the stabilizing of the society due to crash out type stuff of trying to avoid a greater harm from taking place. Eh, That's all open up for discussion. But the point being is that the fiqh sometimes is addressing a society which there's no change. So you have to be careful that you're not uh like for instance, like in some cases, especially in marriage issues, like you're not imposing something that doesn't exist in this society. Like you're trying to recreate a reality that doesn't exist. Like you have to be sensitive to that. That's fine. You could recreate some realities, but also you can't just give fatwa and you're imposing a fatwa that belongs to one set of circumstances and it doesn't belong over here, although it looks like it belongs over here. You know what I'm saying? Or else you make a mess. So those types of situations, you know, come up in fiqh, like the one that you mentioned. And part of the logic of that is learning that sensitivity. That's why they use the term surah too. Surah in terms of how does it look? How does it, in other words, the scenario, what does it look like? So they'll tell you that okay, this situation has more than one angle to it, more than one presentation to it, because the mind of the faqih is operating. That's the benefit of traditional fiqh, in that regard. Yeah. Part of the dilemma and the Salafi critique is valid in this regard is this issue. Does the Salah have, 15 wajibat, or does it have 10 wajibat, or does it have 8 wajibat? Like what are y'all doing? You know what I'm saying? So when you have those ijtihadat like that, we can make an excuse for them, but in reality, it does create confusion. Imam Ibn Khaldun mentioned that, and it stops some progress. Like in the Hanafi school, they don't have that problem in the same way. They have other issues, but in the Maliki school, we do have that problem. So because the mukhtasars, they start to clash with each other, right? So then that's why we say, like some of the scholars say, Hada Kitab Darasi. This is a book, this is a textbook for education. It's not necessarily a textbook to take fatwa from on every instance. It's introduction to knowledge, and it may have some beneficial points, so that's why we bring it in, right? But also the importance of the contemporary scholars, and I keep mentioning that because the Izziyah is a contemporary book, as an example. But the contemporary scholars is important to lean on them, and that's sometimes with the traditional school. Although they talk about isnad and this and that, a lot of times when they talk about leaning on the scholars, they're talking about the sheikh in tasawwuf. They're not necessarily always talking about the scholar in ilm. As a matter of fact, some of the Sufis have inclined to the whole repeating the same problem of knowledge that was there in the past. That who do you take from Sheikh al-Ilm or Sheikh in Haqiqa and Tariqa? And so then they put the Sheikh of the Tariqa above the Sheikh in Ilm, although the Sheikh in Tariqa may be a Jahil in reality in terms of the deen. And so then that's when you come up to the a point of, now are you saying that tariqah is separate from the deen? Are you saying that and then all those discussions come in? All those discussions come in and the criticisms of Sufism come in. That's why Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq was against that type of stuff. So Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq set off on reform. So did Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi. So those are the types of scholars that we look at when we start looking at the issue of tasawwuf and fiqh and all of that type of stuff, because they combined between those realities. They didn't separate out and give an excuse and say, well, no, I'm specialized in the matters of the heart and you're specialized in ilm al-dhar. That type of division is extremely problematic. That's a problem in knowledge, not a problem in deen. That's a problem in knowledge among the scholars. That's a scholarly issue among themselves. But that's not an issue in deen. The knowledge of deen remains because none of those types of issues existed with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in the case of the Sahaba, sometimes they were corrected on those issues because you have people like Abu Dhar, which inclined heavily towards Zuhud, but he was a faqih. And you have people like Abu Huraira, you know what I'm saying, that had a lot of knowledge but didn't have a lot of experience. And that's not a ta'an or is not a criticism or a taking away or belittling of the Sahaba, right? Because the reality is, like Imam Ibn Taymiyyah said, is that the knowledge of the Sunnah is when you take all of the Sahaba together, not one of them. So, in any event, that's important to keep the model together because when we were studying Umdat al-Muta'abidin of Sheikh al-Islam Uthman bin Fodi, rahmatullahi alayhi, that's one of the things that he emphasized is that there's the knowledge of the Dhahir and the knowledge of the Batin together. You know what I'm saying? He brought them together, right? And that's important to bring them together. When you don't bring them together, you have lapses in the fiqh and in the spirituality. You open up to bid'ah, and especially fiqh without hadith, you know what I'm saying, is detrimental. So the scholar of fiqh should study hadith. The scholar who wants zuhud should study hadith. And of course, all of that comes back to also having a knowledge of usul al-fiqh as well, and the maqasid of the sharia and so on and so forth. And that uh, opens up for another series of discussions. But on that note, we end. And until next time, we stop. We ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala for to forgive us for our deficiencies. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.